She was born with a trembling voice, uneven eyes, and a face that leaned to one side. Maria Theresa of Bourbon Parma didn't rule. She hid. Crushed by chronic depression, paralyzed by social anxiety, and burdened by a face shaped by centuries of royal inbreeding. She spent her life avoiding mirrors, people, and the throne she believed still waited in the afterlife. She was born in the cold of January, 1817, in the Duchy of Lucca, a city dressed in medieval stone and Bourbon expectations. Her arrival stirred no revolutions, no church bells rang. The world, still reeling from the Napoleonic storms, barely blinked. But inside the walls of her family's estate, a hush fell. A daughter had been born to the House of Bourbon Parma, a house of brittle prestige and ancient rot. Maria Theresa's parents, Charles II of Parma and Maria Theresa of Savoy, were cousins bound not by love, but by protocol. Their marriage, like most royal unions of the age, was a knot of politics, piety, and pedigree. And with it came centuries of inbreeding. Their bloodlines bore the names of emperors, saints, and martyrs. But under a microscope, that nobility was frayed. Generations of cousin marriage had left its mark. Maria Theresa was not the first of their children to be delicate. She was simply the one who survived long enough to carry that fragility into adulthood. Her mother had lost babies before. Some never opened their eyes. Others coughed and shrank until the cradle fell still. Maria Theresa lived, but always seemed one step removed from health. Her skin was pale with a bluish hue, the kind that never warmed in summer light. Her lips quivered when she spoke. Her voice broke easily, a thin string pulled too tight. And her eyes, those mismatched, sorrowful eyes, never seemed to focus on the same place at once. Even as a child, she looked both at you and away. The midwives said nothing. The priests baptized her without question. And the family moved forward with the same quiet denial that had preserved dynasties for centuries. Whatever was wrong, if anything was wrong, would be softened by distance, silenced by etiquette, and locked behind brocade doors. She was the seventh child, born into a house more familiar with loss than laughter. Her early years were shaped by movement. Political exile forced her family from court to court, from Parma to Florence, from dreams of influence to the reality of irrelevance. No single home ever lasted long enough to be remembered. Her nurseries were rooms borrowed from defeated princes, drafty villas lent by distant cousins, silent chambers in border cities where no one cheered their name. Her sense of place was replaced by a sense of caution. She grew up not with dolls or picnics, but with curtains drawn and whispers echoing through marble halls. Servants were instructed to keep their steps light. Maids spoke in low tones. Her mother, often cold and distant, believed in rigid schedules and rigid posture. A princess must be trained like a violin, tightened, tuned, never out of place. Emotional warmth was not part of the routine. When Maria Theresa cried, and she often did, it was met not with comfort, but correction. "Stand up," they would say. "Straighten your dress. Do not look like that in front of your brother." Her tears were described as excessive. Her silences were labeled insolence. Her reluctance to join games or greet guests was punished, not questioned. What the family failed to recognize as social anxiety, they instead saw as rebellion. But she wasn't rebelling. She was retreating from a world that didn't seem to want her in it. Her education was precise, old-fashioned, and entirely impractical for someone of her disposition. Latin, catechism, court history, embroidery. She was praised for her posture and criticized for her blank expression. Tutors taught her the history of Catholic monarchies, but never how to soothe the ache in her chest. No one asked her why she hesitated before entering a room, why her hands trembled during Mass, why she often avoided looking into her own reflection. By the time she was 10, she had learned to disappear without leaving. She would sit in corners during family dinners, fold her hands so tightly they left crescents in her skin, and murmur prayers under her breath while laughter echoed down the long dining tables. Her siblings, more robust and more politically useful, were paraded before guests and diplomats. She was kept away, first out of protection, then out of embarrassment. There was a portrait commissioned when she was 12. It never hung in any gallery. Her mother had it done by a minor artist in Florence, a soft charcoal rendering meant to be shown only to close relatives. The result was haunting. The girl in the image had a tilted face, her mouth set in a line too heavy for childhood, and her left eye subtly off-center. Her dress was fine, her hair neatly curled. But something about the image unsettled the viewer. It was quietly removed a few weeks later. No official reason was ever given. Maria Theresa rarely spoke of herself. What little survives from her early writings are fragments. Lines from psalms, occasional notes about the weather, and once scrawled in the margin of a devotional book. I am afraid of being seen, but more afraid of being looked at and not known. She loved the rhythm of Latin prayer, not for its faith, but for its predictability. The words did not change. The rules were stable. It was the only time she could breathe. By adolescence, her isolation had calcified into expectation. The family no longer asked her to join public events. Her name stopped appearing in correspondence about court affairs. Her mother began making plans for the other daughters' marriages, but left Maria Theresa's page blank. No scandal was spoken. No exile declared. She simply began to fade. From plans, from gossip, from memory. And all the while, the world outside her window changed. Monarchs fell, cities modernized. A new Europe stirred from the ashes of Napoleon. But Maria Theresa remained still. A young girl in a silent villa, dressed in black lace far before morning was due, watching candlelight flicker across a face she could no longer recognize. She was born into royalty, but never into power, never into purpose, only into shadows. There was no single day when it began, no dramatic moment of collapse, only the slow dimming of presence, like a candle burning quietly in daylight, unnoticed until the room had gone dark. By age 12, Maria Theresa was no longer simply shy. She was unreachable. Her voice, once merely soft, became erratic. She would begin a sentence, pause mid-breath, and stare down at her hands as if they alone might finish the thought. Her tutors reported increasing absences of attention, but the truth was far heavier. She wasn't distracted. She was overwhelmed by the mere act of existing in the world. Church became unbearable. She had once found rhythm in liturgy, but now, even the gentle cadence of the Latin psalms caused her pulse to spike. On Easter Sunday, as incense filled the cathedral and the organ swelled, she collapsed near the altar steps, her face pale as wax, her fingers twitching. A physician was summoned, but not for comfort. He was brought to correct her. His prescription was silence. She was confined to her room for a fortnight, instructed to reflect, to pray, to fast. The official explanation, exhaustion. The whispered truth, shame. And the pattern deepened. She began to cry without reason. Long, silent sobs that racked her chest but made no sound. At dinner, her fork would remain untouched. When addressed, she blinked but didn't speak. Servants began to treat her like a statue, polishing the space around her but never meeting her eyes. Her mother called it an unfortunate temperament. Her father, more distant, referred to her in letters as "my delicate daughter," the same phrase he used for broken clocks or chipped porcelain. Doctors were consulted, but the language of the day had no room for nuance. The term assigned to her was melancholia, a vague label that suggested weakness without understanding it. And so came the treatments: ice baths to shock the nerves, isolation to quiet the spirit, daily confessions to cleanse the mind. None helped. Some harmed. When she screamed during one session of forced immersion, the nuns assigned to her bedside told her it was the devil resisting grace. She stopped screaming after that, but she didn't stop fearing water. She began to avoid certain textures. Silk made her skin itch, lace choked her neck. Her fingers, once praised for embroidery, now fumbled with thread. She grew obsessed with patterns, tracing the same line on the window pane, counting her steps from bed to door, whispering Hail Marys in odd multiples. It wasn't piety. It was survival. In a world she couldn't control, numbers obeyed her. Routines obeyed her. Her behavior wasn't hidden from the family, but it wasn't understood either. Her siblings grew cautious. Some mocked. A cousin once laughed at her for walking backwards out of a parlor, convinced she would faint if anyone saw her leave. A lady-in-waiting later recalled, she was afraid of people, but more afraid of being laughed at. And she was laughed at often. The more she broke, the more they locked her away. Her room was moved to a quieter wing of the villa. She no longer dined with the family. Her presence at Mass became optional. Even the household calendar removed her name from social duties. She had not misbehaved. She had simply failed to function. By 14, Maria Theresa had begun to question reality in private. Her diary, still preserved in fragments, shifts from practical observations to fevered metaphors. My thoughts are needles. My breath is ice in my throat. I have been forgotten while still in the room. One entry simply reads, "The mirror says nothing back." A priest was consulted, not for confession, but for correction. He spoke to her of demons, of temptations, of God's test. She nodded. She agreed. Then she returned to her room and refused to eat for 3 days. Her lady-in-waiting grew concerned. She wrote to her cousin in Vienna, "The princess will not speak unless asked 3 times. She says she cannot feel her hands. She asks me if God can see someone who does not wish to be seen." That winter, she became fixated on a single icon, an old depiction of Saint Dymphna, patron of the mentally afflicted. She kept it beside her bed, lit candles for it nightly, and once was found whispering to it in Latin. When questioned, she claimed she was practicing her conjugations. She wasn't. In truth, Maria Theresa was losing the ability to hold herself inside her own skin. Her posture, once rigid from etiquette, now slumped from exhaustion. Her gait faltered. Her eyes, uneven by nature, seemed even more distant. Her voice cracked mid-word. A physician noted that her hands trembled even at rest. Another reported that she struggled to distinguish thought from feeling. But none of these observations led to compassion. They led to avoidance. She became, for all intents and purposes, a living absence. No one dared speak the word madness. It was too strong, too final, and she did not fit the image of a raving lunatic. She was quiet. She was polite. She did not scream or tear her clothes or speak to ghosts. But she was disappearing, not dramatically, not loudly, but thoroughly. She would spend hours standing at her window, watching nothing, not even seeing the movement of the trees. When visitors came, she asked to stay in bed. When her mother insisted she receive a diplomat's wife, she stood behind a curtain, answering only in nods. She once confessed to a servant, "When people look at me, I don't know where to put my face." And then, in a whisper too soft for comfort, "I wish I had no face at all." It was not madness, it was despair. And no one knew what to do with a princess who had no appetite for power, no resilience for expectation, and no strength left to pretend. It began, as most royal duties do, with a dress. Not a choice, but a sentence. At 16, Maria Theresa was summoned from seclusion to prepare for her first formal presentation at court. Vienna was distant, grand, and hostile. The gowns were heavier than she had expected. The shoes, unfamiliar. The hairpins, sharp. She sat for hours while attendants pulled, pinned, powdered, and corrected, as if beauty could be carved into her with enough effort. Her face, already asymmetrical, resisted symmetry. Her mouth, naturally turned downward, betrayed no expression but quiet grief. Her eyes, mismatched, hesitant, were the only part of her left unpainted. She didn't speak. She didn't object. She simply stood still while they sculpted a girl she no longer recognized. The carriage ride to the Habsburg court felt endless. She was told to sit straight, not to fidget, to smile, but not too widely. A princess must float, not falter. Her heartbeat, however, did not follow protocol. It galloped beneath her corset, like a panicked creature trying to escape. When she arrived, the world didn't pause. It didn't welcome her. It merely looked. The ballroom was a cathedral of expectation. Chandeliers like frozen fireworks, mirrors stretching endlessly, violins humming beneath breathless chatter. Dozens of eyes turned toward her, and in that instant, she ceased to exist as a person. She became a symbol, a silhouette, a collection of flaws examined in silence. She was introduced by title, not name. Her first curtsy came too slow. Her foot slipped slightly. Her hands trembled as she reached for the Count of Schönbrun's greeting. She couldn't maintain eye contact. Her voice, what little emerged, was barely above the whisper of silk across the floor. One lady-in-waiting later wrote that she looked like a bird unsure if it was invited or hunted. When she laughed, it was nervous. When she smiled, it collapsed too soon. She tripped once, barely, and the ripple of chuckles that followed was small but unforgettable. That moment would loop in her mind for weeks, each time louder, each time more suffocating than the last. Her mother, humiliated, withdrew her from the second evening of festivities. Her father sent word to Parma. "The child is not suited for presentation. We shall revisit her place in court matters." Her name was quietly omitted from future appearances. What was meant to be her debut became her quiet dismissal. And so, the rumors began. Not dramatic ones, just enough to stain. She was too nervous to marry. She lacked grace. She cried when spoken to. She avoided mirrors. Some claimed she was epileptic, others whispered about madness. A few blamed her mother's line, saying the Savoys were cursed with weak daughters. None of it was said aloud in her presence. But she felt it all the same. And she remembered. Every dress fitting that ended in tears, every prayer whispered behind a fan, begging for invisibility. Every instance when laughter in the room paused slightly as she entered, then resumed, just a fraction too late. She became a ghost at events. Present, but not acknowledged. Dressed, but not adorned. Introduced, but not invited into conversation. And the more she was ignored, the more her fears were confirmed. She was not a princess. She was a burden in pearls. Her younger cousins took to calling her La Sombra, the shadow. At one dinner in Trieste, she froze mid-bite when a diplomat asked if she would be traveling to Paris for a cousin's wedding. Her fork never reached her mouth. Her hand shook. Her face drained. A long silence followed before her aunt, seated beside her, replied, "She is unwell." Maria Theresa said nothing. She didn't speak again for the rest of the evening. Afterward, she wrote a single sentence in her diary. "If the world requires me to perform, then I must be excused from living." There were moments when she tried, when she truly did. She practiced greetings with her maid, tried to hold her shoulders straighter, even rehearsed smiles in the mirror, though she could barely stand to look at her own reflection. But the effort exhausted her. Each attempt to appear normal drained her to the point of collapse. She began to count her blinks when speaking to others, anything to avoid direct eye contact. She repeated scripted phrases. "What a lovely evening. I hope your journey was smooth. Yes, the weather is kind," without variation. But people noticed. The mechanical tone, the vacant smile, the absence of warmth. One visiting duchess remarked, "She is like a porcelain doll placed too close to a fire, still intact, but forever warped." And so they stopped inviting her. Royal calendars moved on. Diplomatic functions no longer required her presence. Her sister attended receptions in her place. Her portrait was removed from the gallery in Lucca. The seamstresses stopped measuring her. A woman not yet 20, already written out of history's margins. In the quiet that followed, she didn't rebel. She didn't protest. She simply sank. Her withdrawal wasn't a performance. It was a surrender. By 17, she avoided eye contact entirely. By 18, she wept when someone touched her arm without warning. By 19, she asked to sleep with the curtains closed during the day. By 20, she refused to leave her room when unfamiliar guests were in the house. She wasn't disobedient. She wasn't lazy. She wasn't arrogant. She was terrified. And in a palace built on ceremony, on spectacle, on presence, the greatest sin was to be unseen. There was never a formal rejection. No thunderous letter, no public scandal. Just a silence, a slow, unmistakable stillness that settled over the house like a fountain refusing to lift. By the time Maria Theresa turned 20, the question of her marriage had become a topic too delicate to speak aloud, but too urgent to ignore. For a Bourbon princess, especially one with ancestry tracing back to the kings of France, Spain, and Parma, marriage was not a choice, but a duty, a political arrangement, a continuation of bloodlines. But her name did not circulate in embassies. Her portrait was not exchanged between courts. No foreign prince requested her hand, not because she was forbidden, but because she was forgotten. There had once been whispers of a match with an Austrian archduke, a quiet proposal floated by her father during a visit to Vienna. The archduke, younger and already entangled in other prospects, never responded. His silence was answer enough. Another potential union, this time with a cousin from the Bourbon line in France, faltered when a private envoy reported that the princess does not appear in full possession of emotional vigor. The phrase was vague, but it was fatal. After that, no more offers came. And within the halls of her family's estate, a quiet decision was made. She would not marry, not officially, not in words, but through absence. Maria Theresa, of course, understood. Not all at once, but gradually. through the shrinking of conversations, the polite evasions, the way her mother's voice changed when the subject of weddings arose. No longer expectant, just cold. She stopped asking questions. She stopped hoping. When she overheard her younger cousin being measured for a trousseau, she said nothing. When guests brought up their engagements, she excused herself from the room. When her sister received congratulations on a betrothal to a Neapolitan nobleman, Maria Theresa smiled, tightly, mechanically, and turned away before the tears could rise. It wasn't jealousy, it was erasure. At night, she would kneel beside her bed and whisper the same prayer. Not for love, not for children, not even for a husband, but simply, let me be needed by someone. That prayer was never answered. Behind closed doors, her mother grew harsh. One letter survives, addressed to a confidant in Turin, in which the Duchess writes, "She will not marry, not because I forbid it, but because she is not made for it. Her nerves are too soft, her spirit is too thin. She would weep through her wedding night." It wasn't cruelty, it was resignation. And still, there were days when Maria Theresa was summoned to dress, to stand, to be fitted. Just in case. A visitor might come, a distant cousin might still inquire. But each time the silence followed. There were no serious prospects after 1837. She was 20. Her time was considered past. One lady-in-waiting, writing many years later, recalled, "She once asked me if it was wrong to love someone who did not exist. I told her, no. That kind of love is the safest." In 1839, everything changed. A letter arrived from exile, not from Vienna nor from Paris, but from London. It came from Carlos Luis de Bourbon y Braganza, the son of the defeated Carlist pretender to the Spanish throne. Carlos VI, as he called himself. His father had lost the Carlist War. He had been denied the Spanish crown. He lived now in the shadows of Europe, wandering from Britain to Austria, a king without a kingdom, a monarch only in title. His line was in disgrace, his name unrecognized by most courts. But he still believed, still claimed, still signed decrees as if his word held power. And Maria Theresa, quiet, fragile, cast aside, was offered to him. No one else wanted her. No one else wanted him. It was a match born not of affection, but of mutual exile. Their marriage was arranged with little ceremony, no grand announcement, no paintings, no songs. Just a document signed in Trieste, and a modest ring passed between trembling hands. She was 22, he was her cousin. Some say she wept on her wedding night. Others say she remained silent throughout the ceremony. But what is known, what she wrote in a rare letter kept by her confessor, is this: "I do not ask to be loved. I ask only to be of use. If I must kneel beside a throne, even a broken one, let it be his." She loved him, perhaps not in the romantic sense, perhaps not in the flesh, but in purpose. She called him El Mártir del Exilio, the martyr of exile. She believed in his claim, in his destiny, in his pain, and through him, she found identity. She signed proclamations with him, attended gatherings of Carlist exiles, sat beside him like a queen, even though no one called her one. When he raised a new flag for a lost cause, she embroidered it herself. She wore black not because she was in mourning, but because she believed she was living under occupation. And yet, even this life, the one she chose or was given, crumbled. Carlos VI, in time, lost faith. Defeated and ridiculed, he renounced his claims, passed the burden to his son, faded into a quieter kind of disappearance. And Maria Theresa, who had made him her reason, her symbol, her survival, was left behind. When he died, quietly, mysteriously, perhaps by suicide, she refused to accept it. To her, he did not die. He simply went ahead. She dressed in widow's black, locked her doors, and told her servants she would wait until she was summoned to join him. And for the last 6 years of her life, she waited. Not for love, not for rescue, but for a throne that never existed, and a man no longer alive. After the marriage, there were no palace gates to cross, no crowds waiting, no anthem played. There was only a villa in Lucca, modest by royal standards, distant from power, shadowed by quiet. That villa would become her world. Maria Theresa did not resist it. She did not ask for more. The echoes of courtly ambition had long faded from her ears. What she sought was not freedom, not authority, not even happiness. It was containment, a space where she could retreat without explanation, a room where her absence would not be questioned, where silence was the rule, not the exception. She was given a suite of rooms on the second floor, overlooking the garden wall. The shutters stayed closed most days. The light filtered in dimly, painting the wallpaper in shades of dusk. She arranged her furniture herself, modestly, precisely. A narrow bed, a crucifix above the headboard, a prie-dieu at the window. No mirrors. She could not bear mirrors. They did not lie, but they accused. She saw in them not just her face, but her failure. The downward pull of her lower lip, the subtle misalignment of her eyes, the tilt of her nose when she tried to smile. She saw what others stared at, what they whispered about, what she had been trained to hide. So she removed the looking glass, wrapped it in black cloth, and asked that it never be returned. Instead, she surrounded herself with saints. Images of martyrs and virgins lined her walls. Figures who had bled quietly, suffered beautifully, vanished without scandal. Saint Cecilia, Saint Dymphna, Saint Rita, women who were not loved, but endured. Their painted eyes watched her as she moved, slowly, deliberately, across the floorboards each morning. She rose before dawn, lit a candle, whispered psalms, crossed herself 3 times, then sat in silence until the clock struck 7. She no longer read letters unless they came from priests. She no longer answered questions unless they were spoken in Latin. She no longer left her chambers unless summoned, and even then, only for Mass. One servant, who remained with her through those years, described her life as a rhythm of whispers and shadows. He recalled how she walked with her head lowered, how her hands trembled when touched unexpectedly, how she muttered entire rosaries beneath her breath while eating. Food became difficult. Some days, she refused it altogether. Other days, she insisted it be brought in precise arrangement. Bread cut diagonally, soup lukewarm, wine diluted. If a spoon was placed an inch too far from the plate, she would not eat. It wasn't vanity. It was fear. Of what, even she could not say. Her lady-in-waiting, a distant cousin from the Savoy line, kept a record of those years in letters now stored in Lucca. In one she wrote, "The princess asked me today if God punishes those who have no reason to suffer, but suffer anyway. I had no answer. Her hands were cold. She had not slept. There were nights when Maria Theresa remained upright until dawn, seated in her chair holding a rosary with such tension that her fingertips bled. Other nights, she was found weeping not loudly, but in complete stillness, tears falling without sound, breath shallow, eyes unblinking. Her journals from this time, sparse, uneven, reflect the descent. Some pages contain nothing but repeated prayers, written in uneven lines. Others contain cryptic notations. The bell rings, but no one enters. My thoughts move like smoke. I have not spoken today. I do not miss it. She wrote not for memory, but for survival, and always in Latin. She spoke less with each passing month. When she did speak, it was often in fragments. Once, when a priest came to administer confession, she greeted him not with "Good morning," but with a line from the Psalms. "My soul is sorrowful even unto death." He said nothing. She continued as if answering herself, "But no one will let me die." She believed in penance, not as an act of faith, but as a means of control. Her daily rituals grew longer, more intricate. Every object had a place, every movement a meaning. She arranged her books by color, not subject. She pressed dried flowers between pages, not for beauty, but for weight. She once told her maid, "The weight reminds me that I am still part of this world." And yet, her connection to that world grew thinner. Visitors were discouraged. When relatives came, they were received in a separate room. She would appear briefly, speak little, smile not at all, and retreat. She stopped celebrating her birthday, refused gifts, kept her name out of the family register. She began to believe she had already died, not metaphorically. She told her confessor, "I think I was buried when I took my vows beside him. This is merely the afterlife." Her health declined, but not suddenly, slowly, a kind of wasting. Her shoulders curved further, her spine bent more visibly. She complained of chronic pain in her neck and hips, likely the result of scoliosis worsened by decades of stillness. Her hair, once thick and dark, thinned. She wrapped it in veils even indoors. Her appetite faded. She became thin, almost translucent, as if her body was erasing itself line by line. Yet she resisted rest. She refused medication. When doctors insisted she take laudanum for sleep, she said, "I do not wish to sleep. I wish to feel less." And then, after a pause, "But feeling nothing is not peace. It is a punishment." In her final years at Lucca, the house itself grew quieter. The staff reduced. The halls emptied. The sounds of children, of guests, of laughter, gone, only the occasional bell, the shifting light through old curtains, and the soft rustle of her skirts as she passed from one darkened room to another. She was not imprisoned, not by walls nor chains. She was free to walk the garden, to dine with her kin, to attend concerts in town. But she chose none of these. Her prison was chosen, crafted, maintained, and it had no bars, only silence, symmetry, and the endless repetition of prayers that offered no relief. Grief didn't arrive with thunder. It came quietly, like water seeping through stone, slow, invisible, but irreversible. In the spring of 1839, Maria Theresa's younger sister died in childbirth. Her name was never widely remembered. She was not a queen, not a scandal, not even a footnote in statecraft. But to Maria Theresa, she had been the last link to something close to warmth. They had not spoken often in recent years, but in childhood, they had shared lullabies, prayers whispered under candlelight, and the long silences that only sisters understand. When the news came, it was not delivered with ceremony. A folded letter, black ink. Fewer than 20 words. Her lady-in-waiting watched her read it once, then fold it twice without blinking. Maria Theresa did not cry. She did not scream or faint. She simply walked back to her room, shut the door, and remained inside for 3 days. No sound came from within. When the maid entered at dawn on the 4th day, she found the windows closed, the bed untouched, and the princess seated upright on the floor, her face blank, her hands wrapped around her knees like a child hiding from a storm. She was whispering, but not in Italian, not in French, not even in her mother tongue. Latin, Psalm 88. My soul is full of troubles, and my life draweth nigh unto the grave. She repeated it again and again, her voice neither rising nor breaking, her tone so measured it seemed carved in wax. From that moment forward, her speech became fractured. She no longer responded to her name. When spoken to in Italian, she answered in liturgical Latin. When asked to eat, she quoted scripture. When urged to walk outside, she whispered the names of saints who had been martyred in silence. A physician was brought from Florence. He examined her from a distance. She would not allow him to touch her. He wrote in his report, "The patient exhibits signs of prolonged nervous fatigue, episodes of verbal dissociation, physical decline likely due to emotional collapse. Recommend gentle care, religious counsel, and abstention from stimulants." No medicine was prescribed. Instead, a bishop was summoned. He arrived dressed in purple, carrying incense and holy water, prepared to perform rites once reserved for the deeply afflicted. He stood before her and spoke not as a healer, but as an exorcist. "You are not broken," he told her. "You are merely under siege." She stared through him as if looking at a figure in a dream she had already forgotten. He prayed. He invoked saints. He touched her forehead with blessed oil. But she did not react. Not in defiance, not in terror, only detachment, as though her body had remained. But her spirit had slipped through the cracks between syllables and incense smoke. From that day onward, her decline was no longer questioned. It was documented. Her hair began to fall out in uneven clumps. Servants collected strands from her pillow each morning, wrapping them in cloth as if handling a relic. Her skin grew cold even in summer, her hands stiff with disuse. Her spine, already slightly bent, curved further, giving her the appearance of someone bowing perpetually toward an altar only she could see. She refused most food: broth, if served in a cup; dry bread, if broken into pieces small enough not to notice; wine, never; meat, only on Sundays, and even then, only if she had slept the night before, which rarely happened. She did not scream, she did not collapse. She did not lash out or resist. She simply withered, elegantly, silently, like a letter never opened. A servant wrote in his diary, "She walks as though trying not to disturb the floor. She speaks to herself as though explaining why she is still alive." By autumn, she was speaking only to one person, her priest. Even then, her conversations were brief and unanchored in reality. She asked him if sorrow could be inherited. She asked if saints could mourn. She asked if grief, when left unresolved, could become a form of worship. He didn't know how to answer. No one did. There were nights when she rose at midnight and lit all the candles in her room, then sat facing the wall, cross in hand, until dawn. Other nights, she lay in bed without moving for 16 hours straight, her eyes open, her lips parted, her breath shallow as if unsure whether to return for another day. When the bishop returned in December, he did not speak of exorcism. He said a prayer for peace and suggested, very quietly, that perhaps what she needed was not healing, but release. No one dared agree, not openly. But her attendants began to prepare for death, even though no illness had been named. Her dresses were no longer tailored. Her meals were delivered on smaller trays. Visitors were turned away at the door. Inside her room, time stretched and curled, no longer linear, no longer relevant. Days bled into nights without rhythm, candles replaced clocks. The ticking of the hallway grandfather clock became a kind of heartbeat she could depend on, until it too was silenced at her request. In her final winter at Lucca, she spoke only once of the future. A lady-in-waiting had asked, gently, if she would like to return to Trieste in the spring, to be closer to her husband's grave. Maria Theresa replied, "He is not in the ground. He is still on the throne. I am only waiting to be summoned." No one corrected her. How could they? She was not mad in the way the world defines madness. She was precise. She was coherent. But she was no longer here. She had collapsed inward, not suddenly, not violently, but like a cathedral left to rot from the inside, beautiful in silhouette, hollow beneath. Her physician wrote in the final report of her time in Lucca, "The patient is alive, but not entirely present. Her soul appears to be grieving something that never arrived." And so she was moved, quietly, without procession, to Trieste, to the final chapter. But that, too, would be written in silence. History does not stop for the broken. It marches forward, loud, impatient, adorned in revolutions and treaties, while those who cannot keep up are left behind, not violently, not cruelly, but with quiet inevitability. Maria Theresa was one of them. By the time she arrived in Trieste, the world had shifted. The map of Europe had redrawn itself in fire and ink. Thrones crumbled like plaster under new flags. Monarchs were forced into exile. Constitutions bloomed like weeds, and the word people appeared in places where once only kings were named. But inside her villa on the hill, there were no proclamations, no speeches, no cheering crowds. Just the persistent wind off the Adriatic, the faded scent of candle wax, and the soft creak of her chair as she turned it, always to face the window, though she never truly looked outside. Trieste had once been a haven for exiles, a city of half-promises and foreign tongues. It welcomed the defeated with civility, not celebration. And for Maria Theresa, it became the final border between memory and oblivion. She brought with her a small entourage, one maid, one confessor, and a box of letters wrapped in silk ribbon, each addressed to Carlos VI, Rey de España. She kept them in a locked drawer beneath her nightgown. When she died, they were unopened. The house was large enough to echo, but not large enough to entertain. Its corridors were lined with portraits from another life. Her husband in military regalia, her father seated stiffly beside a globe he never ruled, her own mother, painted younger than she had ever seemed in person. These faces stared out from their frames with the permanence of oil and varnish, witnessing nothing, forgiving nothing. She spent most days in one room, not because she was confined, but because she chose to confine herself. Her world became smaller by choice. The room was painted in a pale gray that faded with the seasons, its furniture sparse, arranged not for comfort, but for stillness. A wooden prie-dieu by the window, a high-backed chair with thinning velvet arms, a cabinet of rosaries, a table bearing a silver-framed miniature of her husband, young, noble, already fading. She had stopped calling him by name. To her, he was simply El Rey. She spoke to the portrait sometimes, not in conversation, but in murmurs, as one might address a relic or a grave. Outside, revolution churned across Europe. In 1848, uprisings lit the continent like brush fires. Protesters filled the streets of Vienna, Paris, Milan, Berlin. Kings fled. Parliaments formed. The world she had once been born to inherit now belonged to merchants, writers, generals. But inside her villa, the curtain stayed closed. She asked once, when told of an emperor's abdication, did he leave the crown behind, or did someone take it from his hands? No one answered. She didn't expect them to. She was no longer part of that world. Not really, not even as an echo. The Bourbon Parma name had faded from relevance. Her husband's claim to the Spanish throne had passed to his son, Carlos VII, a man she never spoke of, never acknowledged. To her, there had only ever been one king, and if he was dead, she would mourn him forever. If he was not, she would wait. Either way, her life had become a vigil. The housekeeper said she spent entire days without moving, seated in the same chair, lips parted as if caught mid-prayer, hands folded not in devotion, but in exhaustion. Her maid noticed that she no longer reacted to sound. The knock on the door, the church bells, the shifting winds through the shutters. It wasn't deafness. It was detachment. She had withdrawn so far into herself that even the senses had become optional. She spoke less, wrote nothing, no longer kept a diary, no longer signed her name to letters. When her niece came to visit from Vienna, she found her aunt seated in a wool gown, staring at a blank wall. When she approached and knelt to kiss her hand, Maria Theresa did not turn her head. Only after several minutes did she whisper, without moving her lips, "You're the one with the voice. Use it for something kind." It was the only thing she said all month. The priests who came to give her communion noted how gently she held the wafer, how she lingered before swallowing, as if reluctant to consume the only ritual she still recognized. One described her as a vessel emptied of the world, but still echoing something sacred. In those final years, she refused visitors almost entirely. Not from pride, not from shame, but because conversation had become unbearable. Words required effort. Questions demanded presence, and she had none to give. She stopped attending Mass, not because she lost faith, but because the walk became too difficult, the attention too sharp, the expectation too cruel. Instead, she built a shrine beside her bed, a small wooden crucifix, a candle that never extinguished, and a jar of dried lilies from the last garden she had seen. The only time she left the house was to visit the chapel, alone, unannounced, veiled in black. She entered silently, sat in the back row, and left before the benediction. She confessed less. She sinned less. She lived less. And the world, not unkindly, forgot her. Not with malice, just with momentum. Time swept her aside like dust in a vaulted hall. Once sacred, now locked, remembered only by echo. And in that quiet, she waited. Not for redemption, not for restoration, but for reunion. Silence, at first, had been a comfort. It was soft, predictable, safer than any word she could utter, safer than eyes turned toward her, safer than the sound of her own name. But over time, it stopped being a shield. It became the shape of her life. In her final years, Maria Theresa no longer spoke, not because she had nothing left to say, but because speech required connection, and connection had become unbearable. The transformation was gradual, like everything else in her collapse. First, she reduced her replies to single syllables. Then, she began answering only in nods. Then, only with her eyes. Until eventually, even that ended. Her mouth remained closed. Her gaze drifted past people as if they were ghosts moving through a space already abandoned. Those who knew her said it didn't feel like defiance. It didn't feel like stubbornness. It felt like her voice had been buried beneath layers of sorrow, too deep for rescue. She hadn't lost her ability to speak. She had discarded it. She communicated through routine. If the candle on the right side of her table was lit, it meant she wanted tea. If her gloves were folded neatly, she was well enough for prayer. If the window remained closed despite the heat, no one was to enter. And if her door was left unlocked, it was the only sign that she was still willing to be seen. She didn't answer letters. She no longer read them. One maid admitted she burned them in the garden before they reached her. Afraid that even the sight of a royal seal might undo the fragile structure of her routine. Only the priest was allowed to speak in her presence without invitation. He visited once a week. He brought scripture, not conversation. She listened without response. He never asked for more. Sometimes he read passages aloud while she stared at the flickering candle flame beside the crucifix. Other times he sat in silence with her, breathing softly, as if afraid his exhale might stir the dust gathering in her bones. The world outside her villa changed constantly. Flags rose and fell, empires shifted. News of war, reform, coronations, and assassinations passed through the streets like seasonal winds. But none of it reached her. She no longer asked about kings. She no longer recognized the names of cities. She once heard the word Spain spoken by a passing visitor and turned her head, slightly, almost imperceptibly, but said nothing. And then she wept that night. Her lady-in-waiting asked why. She didn't reply. But she clutched the miniature of Carlos until dawn. Those who visited her, few and rare, found themselves speaking to a painting. She would not look them in the eye. She would not answer pleasantries. If they spoke of the past, she turned her head. If they mentioned her husband's name, she blinked once, slowly, and looked away. If they asked about the future, she stood and left the room. There were moments when her niece, perhaps the last person she allowed into her silence, would sit beside her and read aloud from poetry. Not for the words, but for the sound. Maria Theresa would close her eyes then, lean slightly toward the voice, and press her hands together as if in prayer. But when the poem ended, she would not thank her. She would not smile. She would only rise and return to her chair, back to the window, back to the fading light that no longer illuminated anything but dust. In the registers of the church, her name still appeared. A line of ink, a footnote, a princess. But in reality, she was already gone. She didn't write. She didn't travel. She didn't speak. Her signature, once elegant and fluid, had been replaced with a faint mark resembling a cross. Her breathing grew shallow, her steps uncertain, her presence nearly invisible. A servant remarked that if she had vanished from the world entirely, it would have taken days for anyone to notice. And yet, she wasn't forgotten. Not fully. Those who tended to her did not pity her. They revered her, not because she was royal, not because she was powerful, but because she endured a kind of grief most people never lived long enough to understand. She became a figure of quiet devotion, a woman whose faith had consumed her voice, whose loyalty had outlived her purpose, whose sorrow had rewritten the very language of her existence. When the priest gave communion, she did not whisper Amen. She bowed her head and pressed the wafer to her lips in complete silence. When he asked if she had sins to confess, she only looked toward the floor. He understood. There were no sins left, only weight, only waiting. The final record of her speech comes not from her household, not from her family, but from a gardener, an old man who had tended the grounds for nearly 2 decades. He recalled one morning in winter, seeing her in the hallway, wrapped in black, hands clasped. As he passed her, she stopped, looked toward him, and said, in a voice dry as autumn leaves, "I hear him walking every night. He never leaves the threshold." Then she walked away. She never spoke again. She died without ceremony. No candle was extinguished at the hour. No royal physician recorded the final breath. No church bell rang. It was not a dramatic death, not a violent one, not even sudden. It was the kind of death that takes root long before the final heartbeat. The kind that blooms slowly in silence. The kind that arrives only after life has been gradually peeled away. Ritual by ritual, gesture by gesture, voice by voice, until nothing is left but breath and bone. Maria Theresa of Bourbon Parma passed away on March 25, 1867, in Trieste. 50 years old, but aged by sorrow far beyond the measure of time. The official cause of death, recorded in a priest's narrow cursive, was nervous fever, a phrase that meant everything and nothing. In reality, it was a collapse of the body after years of emotional starvation. Her heart, fragile by birth and broken by grief, had simply stopped carrying the weight. The servants found her seated, as always, in the high-backed chair by the window. Her hands were folded over her lap. Her lips were parted, but no breath stirred. Her eyes, half-lidded, stared toward the light she had not dared meet in years. She had not spoken for weeks. She had barely eaten in months. But she had continued, quietly, ritualistically, to sit, to wait, to endure. And in the end, she left the world the same way she had moved through it, gently, silently, and largely unseen. There was no alarm. No guards were summoned. No family rushed through corridors. The news was sent not by urgent messenger, but by folded letter, written in careful prose. Her Highness passed in peace, as if she had already been walking away for some time. No national mourning was declared. No black banners were hung from balconies. No symphony was played in her memory. She had been royal, yes, but no longer relevant. She had been titled, yes, but not powerful. She had been married to a claimant, yes, but one who died defeated, unrecognized, lost to the politics of a Europe that had outgrown thrones and forgotten causes. And so, her passing was not a moment of state. It was a footnote, a flicker in a forgotten corridor of a crumbling house. The funeral was private, held in a small chapel outside Gorizia, modest and cold, where the stone echoed every footstep and the candles refused to stay lit. A few priests attended, 2 maids, the gardener, her confessor, who had known her longer than anyone left alive, delivered the rites without embellishment. There was no organ, no procession, no crown placed on the coffin. Only a wooden box, simple and undecorated, sealed without crest, carried by men who had never heard her speak. She was buried beneath the floor of the chapel, in a narrow crypt beside exiled nobles whose names had faded even from marble. Her grave bore her name, her dates of birth and death, and a small cross. No mention of queen, no title of consort, no inscription declaring love, sacrifice, or memory. Nothing to suggest she had once believed herself a monarch's widow. Nothing to mark her faith in a throne that never returned. Just earth and stone and the cold. Some said she died of a broken heart. Others that her body gave in after years of neglect. But the priest, in his final written testimony, recorded something else. The soul of the late princess had long ago moved elsewhere. What died today was what remained of the vessel. And in that sentence, there was no judgment, only understanding, only sorrow. Word of her death reached a few distant relatives. Some sent flowers, others sent silence. Her name did not appear in court bulletins. The newspapers in Spain made no mention. Even among Carlist exiles, those who once toasted her husband as El Rey, her passing was a quiet thing, acknowledged only in private letters, and sometimes not at all. Her clothes were folded and burned. Her letters, hundreds of pages written to a man who had died 6 years before, were locked away, eventually forgotten in an archive. Her portrait, one of the few still surviving from her youth, remained boxed in the attic of a villa that would one day be sold to merchants. The house in Trieste was emptied slowly, room by room, silence by silence. And in time, the last person to speak her name aloud in daily prayer died as well. And then, nothing. Not memory, not myth. Just the absence of both. She had spent her life waiting for a throne that would not return, for a husband who had already departed, for a God who answered in metaphors. She had once been a daughter of Bourbon, niece to kings, bride to a man who called himself sovereign. She had once signed proclamations, had once dreamed of Spain, had once believed her name would be carried forward in history. Instead, she vanished not because someone erased her, but because no one held on. Not loudly, not suddenly, not unjustly, just completely. Maria Theresa of Bourbon Parma did not die in a tower. She was not executed. She was not betrayed. No rebellion carved her name into legend. No revolution claimed her as its victim. She lived quietly, vanished gently, and was buried without resistance. But does that make her story less tragic? Or perhaps more so? Because hers is not a tale of external cruelty, but of internal unraveling, one so subtle, so slow, so carefully hidden that even those closest to her could not fully name it. She suffered not from treason or scandal or fate, but from the quiet erosion of the self. From a grief so faithful, it became her home. From an anxiety so intense, it transformed her body into its prison. From a face marked not by deformity, but by the sorrow of generations. She wasn't wicked. She wasn't mad. She wasn't even forgotten. Because to be forgotten, one must first be fully seen. And Maria Theresa never truly was. She was born into a world that valued her blood, but not her being. A world that asked for beauty, but ignored the toll it took to wear it. A world that demanded poise, but offered no language for fear. A world where silence was seen as obedience, and obedience as perfection. But beneath the corseted dresses, beneath the lowered lashes and the rosary-worn fingertips, was a woman terrified of her own reflection. Terrified of not belonging. Terrified of existing too loudly in a lineage that wanted her quiet. Her death wasn't the end. It was the logical conclusion of a life slowly chipped away by expectation, by grief, by the constant pressure to embody an ideal she was never built to carry. And in this, she is not alone. How many women through history bore crowns they never wanted? How many walked palaces like shadows, too strange for the court, too soft for the throne, too devout to leave, too broken to speak? How many lived entire lifetimes inside rooms where the curtains never opened and the mirrors were always covered? Today, We call it mental illness. We name it. Depression, social anxiety, disordered grief, trauma. But in her time, it was called fragility, weakness, unmarriageability, failure. She was treated not with cruelty, but with distance, with avoidance, with silence so dense it swallowed her whole. And yet, even in that silence, she was never meaningless. Her sorrow was real. Her devotion was real. Her collapse, slow, sorrowful, sacred, was not the unraveling of a ghost, but the testimony of a human soul that simply could not keep pretending. We read her story now, not to mourn her royalty, but to witness her humanity. She was not a failed queen. She was a woman who broke in the shadows and never blamed anyone for it. And perhaps that is the most heartbreaking truth of all. She never asked the world to change for her. She just learned to disappear inside it. So now we ask, not just for her, but for all the invisible lives history has passed over. How many more were locked away? Not in towers, not in cells, but in their own skin, behind their own silence, and beneath names no one dared to remember.